So the big news in the prop trading world is Blueberry Funded has now released instant funding under two different models. Blueberry Funded is one of my favorite props. They've paid me several different payouts, and many users in our prop firm products are also trading with Blueberry Funded. So people have been asking me what I think about the new instant models, and I wanted to make this review to give my opinion as well as walk through a few pros versus cons of the actual account type and what people should be mindful of. This video is sponsored by our free Golden Time Bomb Expert Advisor. Take your trading to the next level through automating the London breakout and the opening range breakout. Click the link in the description to download the EA completely for free. So I generally find that instant funding, which is not cheap, that is expensive, usually is pretty easy to understand. It's a hybrid model of a broker, effectively, where if you look at iFunds, for instance, the amount you pay for the challenge is almost akin to a deposit. X-Rating does something similar, where essentially they are giving you leverage between the amount you pay for the account and what your account size is. Typically, it's a 10x. And then on top of that, they provide you leverage in the account. So they're essentially a broker that gives you a lot of buying power in exchange for strict risk controls through drawdown limits. So this is a model which typically applies to the more expensive types of instant funding, but this is not that. On the other end of the spectrum, you have Aquafunded that has ultra cheap instant funding. Then they make the rules so insanely strict with a 15% consistency percentage and all these crazy rules, which make it that pretty much everybody fails, or likely even a higher percent than in 1 steps or 2 steps fails. They just don't have to pay anybody. And that's also a pretty decent model for them, but not really a great model for the trader. What Blueberry has here is they have Instant Elite and they have Instant Light. Instant Elite is the more premium priced one, whereas Instant Light, we're getting a bit closer to the Aquafunded model. Not quite as terrible, but we're getting a bit closer to that, where they're putting in extremely strict rules, which make it a bit more challenging to actually get paid. So let's first walk through the Instant Elite model and walk through the different points which are standing out to me. The first one here is that obviously there is no profit target. You have no daily loss limit, but you have a max total loss of 10%. On first glance, that seems quite generous, but you do have to know that this is based on a max drawdown type, which is a trailing lock. And this drawdown, per my understanding, is also going to be based on an equity-based drawdown. So this can be really, really nasty because essentially, if your equity goes up during a given trading day, your drawdown can also trail. So here we say is dynamically based on the highest equity achieved at any point during the day, with the max drawdown locking in at your starting balance. So what that essentially means is, let's say you happen to be trading here and your account goes up 3% during the day, but you don't actually close the position. Then it comes back down and you take a loss of negative 2%. Technically, what would have happened is your drawdown would have trailed up because your equity, not your balance, would have gone up 3%. So your drawdown is now all of a sudden up 3%, despite the fact that you lost 2%. So in this example, your drawdown was initially at -10, it's now -7, and you're down -2. So all of a sudden, you only have 5% left. And that's assuming it went up 3% and then hit a 2% loss. So this is not unrealistic if you're risking 2% with a high risk reward style system. So that's really tricky because it's trailing and it's based on equity. And you have to be really, really careful about that. At the same time here, we can see that you need to have 5 minimum trading days. I know at least in one phases, Blueberry usually makes you make at least 0.5% per day to count it as a minimum trading day. I'd have to double check if that's also the case with instant funding, but that's really, really tough and you have to be mindful of that. So it's saying like, hey, you have to make 2.5% in the account just to qualify for a payout. At the same time, you have to wait 14 days to get the payout frequency. And I'm not quite sure yet if you can request a 7-day payout instead, but that is definitely something to be mindful of. So the main thing that is kind of standing out is this is not horrible because the cost, $200 on a $5,000 account, that's a little bit under 5%. So it's not necessarily the end of the world. You don't have to make a tremendous amount of profit on it, but you should be really mindful that whatever trading strategy you're using, doesn't have the equity go too far into profit before reversing, or else you can be in serious trouble. So I would use this with some sort of trailing stop style strategy, and perhaps something that has a 1 to 1.5 risk reward and a 1 to 2 risk reward. You wouldn't want to hold this to a 1 to 8 risk reward and then let it come back, because you're going to get very messed up through that based on the fact that it's a equity-based trailing drawdown. You have to be really, really careful about that. Also pay attention to the minimum trading days. That's essentially a hidden consistency rule, so you have to be really careful about that too. So not horrible, but also not great. Like realistically, if you make 10% in this account, you will more than cover your investment and you'll do rather well for yourself. But doing so while at the same time sticking to these rules, you might get your first payout, but I doubt you'll get many more. I always like to compare instant funding versus one steps and say, hey, if I made 15% in each account, what would my ROI be? And you should always take into account what you pay for the challenge as well as what the rules would be. If we compare this to a one step, the same account is $40. So based on that, if you make 15% in the one step account, your ROI is going to be so much higher than the instant one. So really the problem with the instant here is that based on how strict these rules are, you might get one payout, you might maybe even get two, but I doubt you'll get too many more than that, which would inhibit your ROI. Also, one thing to note is that usually trailing drawdowns are affected when you withdraw. So if you withdraw, then you're using up your drawdown room simultaneously, which is really, really challenging. So Instant Elite is not horrible, but it's not great either. Instant Light is now the bad one. Now all of a sudden it's getting way cheaper. You don't need to have as many trading days, which is solid, but you can't have a daily loss over 2%. So this gets quite tricky because now all of a sudden, if price goes up 2% and then comes back to break even, you lose. So you have to be really, really careful to that, because if you're using any sort of non-rapidly closing position, you could be in serious trouble. So I would probably use this actually with an inverted risk reward system, like a scalper. Some of our time bomb bots might, for instance, be appropriate for this, just because you don't want to have any floating profits. Because if you have a floating profit and it comes back, you lose the challenge. So I would be extremely mindful of that. So really, this is now a new entrant on the marketplace. It's not the worst, it's not the best. I would still prefer one steps, but there's very specific types of systems which would work for it. But you really need to be mindful of what the rules are and to match those rules to the trading strategy or trading bot which you're using. So if you have a really tight equity trailing drawdown, you probably want to use a scalper or some sort of inverted risk reward, just because it means that you're not going to hold profits. You're just going to go and immediately take profit, and when you lose, you lose. So particularly as you don't need to make a crazy amount, that is probably what I would do on this. Something with a scalper, maybe a US 30 based scalper is likely what I would use for this one, particularly because Blueberry has great conditions. For this one, I would use maybe a slightly positive risk reward bot at 1.5, but it's trickier just because the ROI is quite a bit more expensive. With Instant Light, also not great, but you might be able to just quickly scalp your way to one payout, take the payout, and then play with house money and kind of forget about it. But I'm not so sure if I would do this with a larger account, because once you start getting the larger accounts, you could probably still have the same math apply, but you likely won't have too many multiple payouts. So in conclusion, I still think one step's the better option, but it could be worth just playing around with a cheap account in the meantime, particularly like some of these are fairly modestly priced. Just test it out. That's likely what I'm going to do, just buy a cheap one and see what I can do, more or less for like R&D purposes and to provide guidance to our community. That being said, the ROI is still vastly inferior to one-phase challenges, but still a cool entrant on the market. Guys, hope you enjoyed the video. I will see you in the next one.